Hi, I was just wondering if you are collaborating with any other groups that are collecting DNA data. Because isn't there a big thing in Iceland, for example?
Right, so there is a for-profit company in Iceland known as Decode, and they've been working very closely with the Icelandic authorities to look at the genealogical information. There's tremendous genealogical information about the Icelandic population. Essentially, everybody knows how they're related to everybody else on the island. That's a for-profit effort. It's aimed at medical research. We're not doing anything that's medically relevant. But in general, yes, we do want to collaborate with as many groups as possible who have samples that have been consented in the proper way for us to do these ancestry studies. Definitely, yeah.
This might be a very simple yes or no question, but how much of this data that you guys have collated across all your different projects is open API structured so that other people can build stuff on top of that to do mashups of maybe something with regards to migratory patterns of people versus a historic figure, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are going to be making our database public this fall. You still need to apply to use it because we want to make sure that nobody's going to take it and run off and patent something or whatever they might be thinking about doing. We want to make sure that it's actually being used for proper research purposes. But yeah, absolutely. The goal is to get this stuff out there into the public domain and allow people to do mashups. Totally. You guys?
On the crisis mapping side, it's the Ushahidi platform is free and open source, is an open API and so on. But I have to say that sometimes open data is not the way to go with these crises. There is personal information, and you can put people at risk quite easily. One project we did with the United Nations in Libya last year, we had a password-protected site for the UN folks, and then a public version that was on a time delay and heavily redacted. So open data is not always the most appropriate, and it cannot, the idea of do no harm applies as well to open data. But otherwise, yes, the Ushahidi platform provides for an open API.
Well, I was just gonna, in our case, we can't have a resource for looters. That's a very big concern. So we've randomized all of the data and completely de-geotagged everything in terms of the satellite imagery. But in other cases that we've participated in, for example, with Patrick and his group in the past, it's not as important to keep that secret. But for archaeology, it's very important to try not to create a roadmap, so to speak, for archaeological looting. So
I think one of the things that actually, we're hoping in working with Patrick more on some of our experiences is maybe not open API, so the data is available, but we were just talking yesterday about encouraging different experience spin-offs so that people can have different communities that would build up. I think Genographic's a perfect opportunity. We had people who were like expert taggers in the Genghis Khan project, and I think we could see haplogroups getting together and having different. They already do it on other sites, so I think there's other ways for it to be open without necessarily making the data open per se.
So sort of a similar question, but I mean, is there any plans to link the genome stuff to other types of data? Obviously, you don't want to start digging up bodies to sort of get a bit further back, and you can't test people.
Well, it depends on the body. I mean, ancient DNA actually is a part of the project.
Is it?
Obviously, only with the right permissions in place.
Yeah. And names, like history of like ancestry, sort of family names and that sort of stuff, sort of pinching in the data, so it becomes.
Yeah. So this is not something that we necessarily see ourselves doing as scientists, but it's something we'd like to enable for members of the crowd who are interested in doing that. So we're not going to start 10 million different surname projects, but if people want to do that on their own, absolutely, the data should be used for that.
Yeah, because I can see people with their families want to animate it and sort of see them all sort of dotting back and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean the goal, particularly with the community aspect, is to bridge that gap between genealogy, the last few generations that you know about from the historical record, and what the DNA is telling us coming up from the ancient past. And there's typically a gap of a few hundred to maybe even a couple of thousand years, and we want to help you fill that in so you have this seamless connection from your parents all the way back to the origin of our species.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's very, very cool. Could I ask I can't remember your name, sorry.
Albert.
Yeah, Albert. Yeah, it seems to me with maps that they're always history as soon as they're made, and I can sort of see maps in the future becoming, video. So like satellites become video, so it's just completely real time all the time, and looking at what you've done, it's because it's all sort of photographic and surface, and sort of basically visualizing movement and people and Twitter and all this sort of stuff. I don't know whether you sort of got slightly depressed when you couldn't go underground, and you sort of and it looked like you were super cool there. I just wondered if you've got any more plans to sort of try and get into those tombs in some way, but you obviously can't do it with satellites. But
right. Well, you can see a lot with satellites. I mean, you can see the fingerprint of what's underneath the subsurface, especially in different wavelengths. So the visible spectrum is only one spectrum, one part of the data that's coming out of those satellites, and certain satellites go much further, and so you can start to get much deeper. And of course, it's frustrating not to go physically down there, and that's why we're trying to use other tools like ground penetrating radar and things like this to look. But fundamentally, my philosophy on exploration from a technological point of view is that technology can be now used to do exploration respectfully. And so the shamans of this area and the people of Mongolia don't want to dig, and so that's something that I'm very proud to find ways of providing knowledge without breaking those traditions. And I think that's the future of exploration. In terms of satellite imagery, you're absolutely right. It's going to end up being video. In fact, there's a company out of San Francisco that's just gotten, I think, past their second round of funding, called Skybox, which is going to make satellite imagery on demand, commercially viable, and video.
Yeah.
HD video from space, which is
Yeah,
a little.
I mean,
We'll see how that plays out from regulation standpoints. But think about the things once we get past the privacy issues that people are going to start doing with their spatial context. It's going to be remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking on tracking ships already, and all that stuff starts coming in, and pixel recognition following a sheep and whatever. It all starts to get interesting. Are you going to go back to Mongolia, or have you got a personal thing to carry on or not?
Well, we've been there. I'm from San Diego, and I've summered there. I'd say for the last 5 years or 6 years now, and I am going back, and I'm working with the government of Mongolia at the government level to take the knowledge that we've gained and try to turn this into power and potentially resubmit to UNESCO as a World Heritage Site for this one very particular mountain. So it's more of that, and define this tomb. I mean, define what we found, right? And what we're trying to do is take that knowledge and allow it to be a point, of shared cultural treasure, specifically, like shared cultural legacy, right? I mean, we don't know about this huge missing key to what we know of as our modern history, and so hopefully by doing this, the people of Mongolia and the people of the world will be able to know and respect more about that part of the world.
It's interesting, what you say about satellite imagery capturing at the different wavelengths. Sarah Parkak, who works with NASA, she's a space archaeologist, which makes her incredibly cool. She's a new emerging explorer at National Geographic, and they've really been experimenting with the non-visible spectrum in doing archaeological analysis with satellite imagery. And it's interesting, they don't need the crowdsourcing to go find it. They actually managed to create an entire map of the city of Tanis. And you can see the subsurface because it was relatively recent. You see every single building, every outline, every door, and it just completely unveiled the layout of the city of Tanis. So they can target now archaeological sites. Now, obviously, this also opens up the door for looting, and if this data were to get out. And so where the crowdsourcing is coming in is they want us to work with NASA to create protection crowdsourcing. So sort of being the virtual park ranger of these ancient sites, which is more about protecting what we just discovered is there and using the crowd to do that versus actually finding the thing anymore.
Solve the looting, just use it on Mars.
Actually,
Exactly.
that's a very good point. We've looked at a lot of different ways in which we can use this kind of concept, from saving lives to, my team at Tomna built the models for the virtual park ranger with trying to track where human encroachment is meeting, basically lion populations and where that's causing conflict. We've tried to do it for video editing. I mean, basically at this point, the really interesting thing is that the power of networks, the power of people, allows you to look with the adaptability of human perception and human intuition, but at a scalable means. And the questions that'll be solved from that are, they're unbounded.
Can I just say I really enjoyed all of the projects that you're presenting. They're fantastic and very inspiring. There's something that Susan said at the beginning, which I wonder if you'd want to comment on. You compared Foldit, and you said, science gets done, but there isn't necessarily any science in the heads of the citizen scientists or the virtual explorers. One view of the kind of image-oriented projects like the ones that TomNod supports is that science is definitely getting done, and people are becoming expert at interpreting images up to a point. But I'm wondering how you get the science, how you cycle the science that people are doing or the good work that they're doing back to them so that they are not just being brilliant at interpreting images and using their perceptual apparatus, but actually getting engaged in the science. And I'm guessing it works out differently for the different projects.
I think that's a great question, and one of the things that we've talked about is when we talk about that experience, that online experience, how do you take the content that's coming out of the project and wrap it around and re-communicate back what the crowd is actually accomplishing? And a lot of that comes into the content that you're generating and how you're actually packaging it, alerting users, passing that information back. I mean, I think Genghis Khan had an amazing, and Albert outlined it, that ground truthing actually added that extra layer. It wasn't just looking at maps. You were seeing, it was like, they were like, we went to spot XYZ and it was this amazing, it was an old tomb. Or we went to spot XYZ and it was a yurt and here's the family that lives there. It actually wasn't an ancient structure. But having that connection with the field, I think, really brought it home to the people who were participating in it. And so it's figuring out how you actually have that for each individual project. And, like the feedback cycles you got from the Marines of it's making sure that the people participating are continue to see the results of their work and want to keep participating.
But I think it is quite difficult. So one of the challenges with crowdsourcing is that it's a data overload. So what you're trying to do is simplify the problem to microtasks, and those microtasks usually have to be very yes or no mono-y kind of things, right? So it's difficult to take in organic information and go in different directions. Now, one thing that I really loved was in Galaxy Zoo. Have you seen Galaxy? They had is anybody familiar with Galaxy Zoo, which was a crowdsourcing project to do analytics of large amounts of satellite data in space and look at the orbit rotations of galaxies and more, right? Just to analyze all that data. And they were really a large part of the inspiration for what I did. I mean, that was an amazing thing to see. But they had this forum where people were talking about, I see this weird thing over here, or I see this weird thing over there. And sometimes they would come up with, at the leaderboard of this forum, some revelation that what they're actually looking at was totally unexpected, and they've published, many, many papers off of that forum. So the conversation was pretty exciting. The challenge, I think, is how do you filter that and analyze it? But those problems are going to be solved. The ways in which we do that are going to be figured out, and as we evolve our way of communicating and listening, I think, mostly through visualization, it's going to become a much deeper feedback loop, which is going to evolve this entire concept.
Well, and you often don't have that info. And that's one of the, this virtual park ranger and some of these conservation programs that we've been trying to get funded. The challenge is the ground truthing portion really is hard to implement. You can't really send park rangers necessarily out to some of these parks to see if that is, confirm that it's human encroachment. Or, and so just having people mark human encroachment on a map without ever coming back and saying whether you saved anything, you did anything, there was any result whatsoever, is a pretty, empty-handed experience. And so it can often impact the whole, if you can't find that piece, you might have the great idea on this end, but you can't close the deal with that. It is an important piece.
Yeah, and in terms of the stuff that we do, it's really a two-pronged approach to get the information back to people. One is, I'm a professional scientist. I may have perhaps insights that members of the crowd don't, access to samples, analytical methods, whatever it might be. We as scientists, therefore, have to take the data that comes out of the study and go and run it through our machine and then publish it in the scientific literature, and then we make an effort again to get it back to people, tell them the story that came out of it. In addition, though, particularly in Geno 2.0, I'm an enabler. What I've created with this new chip and with the information it provides is, in effect, a language of DNA that people can then use to go out and write their own narratives. And that's the goal of the community feature, is to allow people to construct their own stories based around their results.
Thank you.
I'm not a scientist, so I'm very interested to be here today, and you're talking about the power of science. But it's a question, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, the geneticist.
Spencer.
Spencer. So it's a question for you, Spencer. So you're a geneticist and you're a scientist, and you must know about the inexorable power of evolution. So do you not feel a contradiction in yourself when you're trying to stop a language dying out? Because
Well, that's a good question. If you're a social Darwinist, you might argue that some languages are meant to be in the ascendancy and others are meant to go extinct, and that's a natural process. I would argue that we're not necessarily trying to stop that process in every case. What we're trying to do is harness the information before it's gone. In some cases, yes, the communities actually do want to try and grow the number of speakers of their language, like Manx in the UK, which nearly went extinct in the 70s, and the BBC made a big effort to have programming in Manx, and now there are more speakers than there were in the previous generation. That is possible, and it might be desirable if the community wants it. Again, what we want to do is we want to provide a means to capture this information before it's gone. And hopefully to raise awareness about this and to say, listen, we think it's worth preserving cultural diversity. Having a global monoculture is not such a great idea. Think Irish potato famine. It's worth preserving some diversity out there at the cultural level as well. But yeah, I mean, you could take a hard-nosed social Darwinist attitude to this and say it's pointless. And in that case, I couldn't necessarily argue against you because it's something that you feel strongly about and believe.
Thank you.
I was intrigued actually by the fact that you're actually linking up people. For example, many members of a single family may come together and have mitochondrial samples, but also Y chromosomal sampling and Y chromosomal definition, which is potentially notoriously a bit of a time bomb, right? Because a lot of us think we know who our genetic fathers are, and we're wrong. Because
that's not a stated goal of the project.
No, absolutely. I mean, women can philander as much as men, and so we know that a lot of sons are not their father's son. And so are you concerned that if people link up a little too much, they may actually find out things they didn't want to know?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. We tell people that we don't want them to use it in that way. It's certainly not a paternity test. It's not admissible in court and so on. If they choose to use it for those purposes, yeah, you're going to be able to see those non-paternity events, as we call it in the genetics community, pretty easily. It's going to reveal part of the story of who you are. It may be a part of the story you don't want to know, or your father doesn't want you to know.
Very true.
Or both of your dads were ours, and then it's not very accurate test.
Susan, so I work with a professional scientist in paleobiology, and I do a number of citizen science activities ranging from very skilled field ornithological surveys down to things like Galaxy Zoo, which still have some component of training. Yeah. But the idea to me of the citizen scientist, that we are introducing people to the idea that they are helping with science, even if it is observational based, to me is tremendously important, as opposed to public engagement, which I've also done through museum work, which often feels like doing science to people. And there are people in the science communication community who would actually argue if adults catch you trying to educate them, they often at that point become disengaged. Right. So, how do you balance? My sense is that citizen science is a good thing against your engagement models.
I think citizen science I think it's both. I mean, I'm seeing it as both, as somebody who is looking at it, and this is part of the healthy discussion that happens between science and my side of the table, which is the public engagement. And a lot of it's semantics. Public engagement and using it really is the same thing. It's more of an accessibility factor, in my opinion, and how accessible, and there is sometimes a disconnect between the scientific world and the mainstream about what accessible really means. And there's a baseline knowledge of science, that active, PhDs or, people with master's degrees have, but the college-educated group is a very small percentage of the population. And so I guess it's more of a personal belief that I have, but why alienate? Why not go for the maximum number of people that you can reach with these experiences, educate them at some level, and tier that experience? Because of the algorithms that power a lot of these things, you can weed out the people who are not good at it. But what we've found is people who are shockingly good at it and then are inspired to go on, get degrees, want to study this stuff more, learn they're a master tagger, learn they have an eye they didn't realize they had. And if I hadn't actually created an experience that reached them in the first place or that alienated them from the get-go, they would never have participated. So it's absolutely right. It's a discussion. We just created a whole suite. Spencer and I have gone back and forth on having more detailed information for expert users. And
you're adding that, right?
Yeah, we are adding that. Yeah, I've come to see the benefit of having that because it legitimizes a lot of the things you're saying. That it's doesn't just look like it's for show. It's just a quick public engagement thing. It's legitimizing it for that, but it also is making it more accessible.
Maybe I can add a comment. So I was the first person to try to work in this context to introduce let's do this data tagging with Susan, from a scientific point of view. So I'm a research scientist primarily at UCSD, this Cal ITTU Institute. And I had all these big ideas and things like this, and I worked with my research team and cognitive scientists and Susan, and we came together and we said, well, what are the choices that are going to be made to do this swarming thing, and how are we going to do it in the right way? And we continue to do that. And at the same level, it was this constant battle between us and Susan saying, well, you know what, you think that's cool, but nobody's going to come. And then I was saying, okay, well, maybe like all of a sudden realizing that maybe we don't know, internet engagement in the way that somebody who focuses on internet engagement from a production side would, right? So I think it's very important as a scientific community to fight back now and try to touch the public in ways that we've failed to do over the last century. And so that's, I think, our role as members of the National Geographic Society from a scientific community, is to say, well, there's an audience out there that isn't, our graduate students or our colleagues. There's an audience out there that should also care. And so, for example, in our work in Mongolia, I got an email from a woman who had, gotten frustrated at work, started working with our system, and decided to quit what she was doing professionally and go back to school to become an archaeologist at the age of 27, right? So that's one example, right? But that's the role of, I think, National Geographic. It's a public participatory thing, right? In that we as scientists must engage. Otherwise, it's a tree falling in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, right?
Well, and science has a particularly tough job. I mean, when it comes to humanitarian aid, you'll see that people will interface with experiences because of the urgency factor, because they're motivated to help and they just want to do it. They'll use something that potentially doesn't need to communicate it in the same packaging. But when you're just dealing with trying to put a scientific project out there, that it doesn't have that same motivation. Your threshold is higher to get people to participate, so you kind of have to go to them a little bit and pull them out. And it's something that has been one of the most rewarding parts of my job, to continue to evolve that conversation around science communication with scientists. And it can be very frustrating, but it's really, really fun.
We hate
because
most of the time.
Yeah, no, we don't. No, but it's like in the middle is a successful thing that millions of people use. It's really, really easy to build something that people who are already knowledgeable on the topic will use. That is so super easy. You can just do that with your eyes closed. You don't need a team to do that. But you need a team to I want the person who never, ever, ever thought they would ever care about ancient ancestry, or never, ever thought they would help Haiti, or who the heck is, I still say Genghis Khan because I can't change, but I try. Genghis Khan. Who the heck is Genghis Khan? That's the person I want in some meaningful way.
Yeah, and this is, it's obviously, I think everybody in the room would agree with this. It's vitally important right now. We have a lot of big issues facing us in the world that we're going to have to deal with in the next century, and a lot of the answers for how we deal with those issues come from science. Science is creating the future that we either want or the one we're going to get, even if we don't want it. And people need to be involved in this, in the debate, the societal debate. Even if they're not practicing professional scientists, they need to have enough scientific knowledge to be able to say something about, oh, we should do something about global warming, because clearly if you look at the data, there is good evidence for it, and we are causing it, rather than being led by politicians who don't know the science either. So a big part of what we're trying to do is to educate the public about the process of science, starting with young kids. I find uniformly, children younger than kind of 4th, 5th grade in the States, so kind of 10, 11, 12 years old, are interested in scientific questions, all of them. And they lose that interest at some point around 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade.
Do the conservation, we can do archaeology, we can do genetics. We're sort of a brand that encompasses a lot of that and makes it accessible to mass audiences. And so we can pull from those different disciplines and make it make sense in a way that I think other brands might not necessarily, because we're sort of a broad-based generic, not generic, but broad-based and broad topic. Just one more thing on the experience side, just an example of what we did with the training component in Genghis Khan was we went back and forth about that training would turn people off, and if they had to go through a training, they wouldn't use it, and I'd lose all the people whose attention span on the internet is 2 minutes or less. Or not their attention span, quite frankly, the time they're spending in between emails and doing this and that. They might click on a link, but they don't have the next, even 10 minutes or 20 minutes to spend getting trained. So we went back and forth, thinking knowing training was important, but not wanting to turn people off. And we came to a solution that I really love and would employ, is that when you come in, you can still go on. It's at
exploration.nationalgeographic.com is the website.
Yeah, and the field expert, you can still tag images. But you go in, and the first 5 images you see have a payoff somewhere in them. And you're not asked to register, and you just go, and you're seeing things. They're actually seeded images. They're images so you're getting trained without feeling like you're getting trained. Because the other thing people hate being told is, we're going to train you. They want to know, they want to learn, but that whole methodology is they're being educated, and they're learning how the system works. And then after the 5th image, they dive in, and they're actually looking at real images, and they're using the methodologies that they've learned in the last 5 images.
And I should include there that it ended up being a very small level of training, not just because of the user engagement issue, but because we didn't want to sway the public direction in terms of what they might define. So scientifically, it was also kind of cool.
But it worked. I mean, you saw the results, and people were very successfully able to distinguish between the very basic things we were trying. Because the weird thing was, can they find weird? We knew they could find roads. We knew they could find rivers. But if they didn't find weird, the whole project was a failure.
Can they agree upon weird?
Yes. And they did.
Spencer, maybe this question's a little bit to help us who are uninformed in some of the progress in the research that you're doing. And I might also push the boundaries of what I can remember from AP Bio. But I'm curious as to, since you might have probably one of the largest databases of international DNA samples, how much progress is being made, is already done in taking some of the genetic mutations of other cultures. From what I remember, sickle cell anemia being a Müllerian intervening type mutation, and having something like that be part of what medicine is being used right now. From your specific research, backtracking and how different cultures adapted to those issues, which are now becoming increasingly global because of the distribution of foods and fruits and everywhere. So you might have diseases that exist in parts of the world that no longer would have not existed there natively.
Yeah, good question. We, as a project, are not doing anything that's medically relevant. So we're not studying sickle cell trait or the G6PD deficiencies that are also a reaction to malaria in the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, all of these things that do have medical relevance. We're simply looking at markers that tell us about ancestry. Now, that said, those members of the medical genetics community who are designing studies to do case control, association studies for, say, diabetes versus, normal people who are not sick with diabetes, need to take into account these ancient migration patterns when they're designing the studies. Otherwise, they can get population stratification, where they see false positives simply due to the population structure that they haven't taken into account. So the old-fashioned way of saying, okay, somebody is Caucasian, which encompasses everybody from Iceland through Russia, through the Middle East, through Morocco, has a huge amount of genetic variation in it, and that's not a real category, nor is black. or African or whatever. I mean, there's a huge range of variation just within West Africa, much less the entire sub-Saharan African continent. So people have to take this into account when they're doing the studies, and I hope that they will. But, you know, again, there's no direct medical relevance coming out of what we are doing by design. Now, in terms of the adaptation to the world around us as we've moved around the planet, that is something we're very interested in, and we're starting to make forays into that very, very carefully, because it's easy to verge into the medical realm when you start looking at functional regions of the genome. And what is a disease in one context could be highly adaptive in another. The best example of that would be this notion of the thrifty genotype proposed by Jim Neal, an American geneticist in the 1960s, who said that, you know, think of Polynesian voyages, people going off to Samoa, this long roundabout route through the Pacific. The people who are really good at sucking away calories are the ones who survive to pass on their genes. Then you introduce the 20th century American diet there, and suddenly you've got a huge obesity and diabetes problem. So what is highly adaptive to the environment in one context becomes a disease in another context. And so that's always a concern. But it's a very interesting question. How have humans actually changed genetically in response to the environment? I mean, an obvious way is my skin color doesn't look anything like my ancestors back in Africa would have looked. They would have had darker skin. So I'm a mutant. I've adapted to northern latitudes so that I can synthesize enough vitamin D. Those are really interesting stories, and they're ones that we would like to start exploring.
There's a question on language. Obviously, all these languages are incredibly important in our understanding of the width of it, like Sanskrit or whatever it may be. And I always ask this question when you say about saving something. It's a bit like saving a panda. It's a pretty waste of time. It's a useless animal. But with language, just eats and
Hey, this
sleeps.
is National Geographic. Be careful.
But with language, when is part of your criteria for the funding to save the language that there might be some sort of focus group that's actually not just speaking for the sake of speaking it, but actually sort of going into it and understanding it and translating it and getting to the actual where it came from and the reason for it being formed in the first place. That because I appreciated the Plato big time, because there is no answers, and you look at the stars, you get lost and depressed, and so you need to somehow just chill out with all this. But yeah, I mean, if it's going to mean anything, saving all this stuff, then we've got to have people go, oh, hey, did you realize this concept is actually really cool and this will make you happy?
For me as a scientist, absolutely. That's part of the incentive to do this. No. If the culture decides they want to preserve their language simply because they feel that it's important to preserve it, if it's a good application, if it's competitive with the others we receive in that round, absolutely, we will fund it. It's led by the communities themselves. Now, we want things to be sustainable. We tend to view these grants as kind of seed funding. We're kind of like venture capitalists in the social realm, and we're trying to start something new that we see becoming bigger and perhaps being translated to other groups. But no, in some cases, it is purely people going out and creating a website, a private web community, which nobody outside the group is able to access, so that they can preserve that language and help teach it to the kids.
Is it a bit like these house decoration things? You'll go back in 5 years and see what's happened?
Yeah, I mean, that would be very interesting. Certainly, we're trying to track the grants that we've given and see what the longer-term effects are. You know, for me, I think there should be pragmatic reasons, ideally, to preserve these languages. And I give you the example of the Shuar people and the ethnobotanical knowledge. I mean, to me, this stuff is really important. Perhaps less important to simply preserve one language, one sub-dialect of, you know, Crow spoken in South Dakota by a group of 12 people. You know, in the grand scheme of things, you know, it's hard to make the case that that's more important than, you know, something else.
This is why I say about the mixing data, because if you sort of then get a concept that we've forgotten about in BASC and it's actually in your genome tree, and you start going back and go, these people think you should do this, and you know, oh shit.
Well, and so we have actually funded historical linguists who are working closely with communities to study the structure of these languages. So there's a project at National Geographic called Enduring Voices, led by a couple of linguists, Greg Anderson and David Harrison. Very talented young linguists who spend a lot of time out in the field working with these communities. They've discovered completely new languages, fascinating stories there, and we've helped to fund some of their research. Yeah.
Okay. Are you asking whether or not what's the value in saving languages? Is that fundamentally?
No, the value is really, really important. It's just asking, you know, whether you're sort of leveraging the actually saving you, spending money saving them, but making sure you really get the real value out of it and it's coming back into everybody else rather than just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, for me, this revelation, not that about knowledge creation, that sort of thing, right? Essentially means that we are today the accumulation of all of the knowledge of all of the past civilizations that we still have records for and can still learn from, right? But without capturing some of that, if we let those all disappear, then all of those cultures, they won't add to the summation of future generations. So, we're trying to evolve our human society as a whole, and that depends upon being able to capture that knowledge from many different places.
You have to know where you came from to know where you might be going, or rather more poetically, as the French philosopher, what was his name? Henri something, I forget right now, it's jet lag. L'histoire est un grand présent et pas seulement un passé. History is a grand view of the present, not simply something in the past.
All right, last question.
Hi, I'm French actually, but I don't know this one. I'm a filmmaker and musician, and I love the project you talked about today, and I would love to see the same happening within the arts and the way you scientists engage with communities. I would love to see that happening with the arts as well. And do you think you will be interested with involving artists in your project? Because I would like to do a PhD myself as well, and the same kind of scale. Oh wait, from my own origin, not Mongolian, kind of.
Oh, for example, from a crowdsourcing perspective of data collection, I forget who did this project, but one of the cool projects that I remember early on was an artist tried to get everybody to submit an image of a left-facing cow, or I think it was a left-facing sheep. I don't know if everybody's heard of that project, the left-facing sheep project, and just put a call out there and got tens of thousands of left-facing sheep, and then put it onto a mural, and that was his art expression of a community basically trying to identify their left-facing sheep themselves, almost a self-reflection of a lack of individualism or something, but it was really cool, and for me that was some of the philosophical concepts of all those. I personally, yes, it would be awesome to try to find ways of doing this, and I think that what Susan was alluding to earlier is that there's projects coming down the pipeline that are looking specifically at art and how to piece parts of these fragments together and things like this and those types of things. So.
And the Johnny Cash Project, have you heard of that? You should Google it. The Johnny Cash Project is it's a combination of art and music, and essentially they took and asked the crowd to illustrate a frame of one of his songs, and then completely crowdsource the effect, so it plays like a movie. But and then you can see every individual that also illustrated that particular frame, and then you can change the movie to play different sequences of people's visualizations and frames. So it's a collective visualization of music played in, and it's a really amazing project. There's, all of this is not, citizen science is sort of what we're focusing on, but the same techniques and the same sort of inspiration is being used in music. It's being used, there's a lot of crowdsourced music projects and artistic projects that are out there that are very cool.
Well, I'm going to add one last thing. I think the biggest challenge to what we're facing right now is the data avalanche. And so that's where data scientists are now really having to become artists, because you have to visualize all of this knowledge to be able to understand it. So, the frontiers of science, I think, lie in the visual representation and artistic expression of the data so that we can understand what's going on. And so,
that's exactly what I would like to happen. It's like this collaboration between artists and scientists. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.